Well, hello there, and welcome back to youtube.com/Bradley Hall Guitar. So, I'm quite aware that a lot of you guys have used my channel as like a gateway to get into not just metal itself as a genre, but all the different sort of like sub-genres and sub-sub-genres. And it occurred to me that something I've never actually done is to make a kind of definitive roadmap, history, family tree kind of thing of the entire genre of metal. And I've seen various videos of channels sort of trying to do this thing, but I've never seen one that felt like really complete and definitive. So that is what we are going to do today. Armed with nothing more than this glorious blank paint.net project, I'm going to attempt to map out the entirety of the genre of metal with all of its different subgenres, some examples of bands, and sort of give you like a brief overview of the sound of each subgenre, and give you, to the best of my ability, how these genres are all kind of like interlinked in regards to the history and the evolution of the genre. So, you know, let's just get into it. So I'm sure you're all aware that the starting point, the singularity when it comes to the formation, the creation of metal, started with Black Sabbath. Before then, there was nothing really that sounded exactly like what we know as metal today. You know, there were some examples of like, I guess, heavier, more aggressive songs from other bands of the time and before. But when it comes to the first definitive metal band that defined the sound, it was definitely Sabbath, right? They made the whole idea of like a sort of a heavy power chord driven guitar riff a thing. The flat 5 interval, the tritone, which is sort of like, the devil's interval, as they say, like the evil, most evil interval of all time. Sabbath obviously led to the formation of the genre of doom metal, so that would be, the next sort of, I guess, logical place to go. If you know Black Sabbath's music, then you know that doom metal is kind of characterized by slow tempos, very sort of like bluesy riffs. So examples of doom metal bands, often thought of as the big four of doom metal, we have Candlemass, Pentagram, Saint Vitus, or Vitus, depending on where you're from in the world, and Trouble. And then there are some sub-genres of doom metal, I suppose, which are worth talking about. So I will preface this actually by saying that throughout this video, I will be talking about like sub-genres, but only like notable ones, not really obscure ones that have like enough notable bands that are worth talking about. So on this front, we have what I guess we would call death doom, okay? Which is pretty much what it says on the tin. Death Doom, very cool name, which is basically just like doom metal, but I guess heavier and with more like guttural death metal style vocals. Often sort of like overlaps, I guess, with like gothic metal as well. There's quite a big sort of overlap there in the old Venn diagram. So popular bands in this style would be Paradise Lost, Anathema, My Dying Bride, excellent band, worth checking out. So yeah, Death Doom, like Doom, but more deathy, I suppose, right? We also have two smaller subgenres, but I think they're still worth mentioning. One is called Funeral Doom. I'm not too familiar with this, but from what I understand, it's similar to Death Doom, but a bit more sort of like ambient. Because like Death Doom, like Paradise Lost and My Dying Bride, they still have sort of like, even though it's a bit more, it's like heavier than regular Doom, it's still kind of accessible, I suppose. Whereas Funeral Doom is less accessible, more sort of ambient-y, maybe there'll be some like keyboards and stuff. Just generally more miserable and funerally, okay? So examples of Funeral Doom, we have Esoteric, Evoken, and I'm not sure how you say this band name, Thurgothon. Okay, but there we go, Funeral Doom. And lastly, we have Drone Doom. So Drone Doom is a bit more sort of like arty and out there, I suppose, where it's sort of like less about songs and more just about the, I guess like the vibe. Yeah, just like very loud, drony noises. Yes, is how I would characterize that. I guess the most famous band in this subgenre would be Sun, with like the funny thing. Well, they're worth checking out. Basically, it just sounds like distorted washing machines. Thoroughly recommend it. Earth and Boris. He's definitely the more sort of well-known bands in this style. All right, and then deriving from doom metal, we do have some other, like, very notable subgenres, in fact. Right, we'll go here, because this is like a whole new thing in itself. So we have stoner metal and we have southern metal. You can kind of argue that like these two genres are like very similar and there's a lot of overlap, which is very true. I'm going to have these branching off to the same thing, like this. Could argue that they're nearly the same thing, but there are some like small differences. So notably with stoner metal, obviously the main theme and like the topics are around, you know, smoking the marijuanas. They're basically just like exactly what you'd expect. More sort of a psychedelic-y, stonery infused doom metal, I suppose. Very popular bands in this style would be Electric Wizard, super cool band. Sleep, I guess, is probably the definitive stoner metal band. And we also have The Sword, which you may remember from Guitar Hero, and Orange Goblin. And what's funny is like these bands sound very, not super different, but like rather different. The Sword is more sort of like, you know, some of their songs are quite fast and a bit almost like thrashy, I suppose, but still very much have that kind of psychedelic-y stoner metal aesthetic. Orange Goblin sounds a bit more sort of like party, like party stoner metal, more sort of groovy. And Electric Wizard and Sleep are more sort of like on the doom side of things. Right, southern metal, very similar, but you know, less about the smoking, less psychedelic, and more sort of about the riffs, I suppose. It's more sort of like riffy. Popular bands in this subgenre would be Black Label Society, probably the most popular. Society. Down, Phil Anselmo's side project, Crowbar, and Clutch, I guess, to a lesser extent. Clutch have a very mixed type of sound, but super southern. Oh, and lastly, actually, I did forget one. We have sludge metal, which I think we'll also include over here. So again, sludge metal it's so similar to stoner and southern, but it's not until you sort of like listen to these bands that you kind of like get a feel for what the differences are. Sludge is just like super heavy. It's definitely like the heaviest out of like these subgenres. Like very, very low tuned guitars, fuzzy, like huge riffs, more aggressive vocals. I guess that would be the main thing, is like definitely more aggressive vocals in sludge metal. So key bands for sludge metal would definitely be I Hate God, Neurosis, High on Fire for sure, and like early Mastodon, like the first couple of albums, was it like Remission and Leviathan, super sludgy. There is sludge metal. What a fantastic name for a subgenre. So I think we'll have that branching off here. All right, looking pretty good so far. So that was the sort of like the doom fork of metal and like the derivative genres therein. All right, so after this, there are two key bands that we need to take note of, really. One is Judas Priest. After Black Sabbath, I would say Judas Priest is probably the most influential metal band of all time. Judas Priest were definitely an out-and-out metal band, but yeah, they don't really fit in like the doom metal category, and they don't fit in Nawabum, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So they were definitely sort of like a progenitor for lots of stuff that came after. And another one we have to talk about is Motorhead. Again, they don't really fit in any of the categories, and they're not really like an out-and-out metal band. They're like sort of metal adjacent, I suppose. But they, you know, massively influence like thrash metal, for example, and like a lot of Nawabum stuff. Just sort of like they just generally helped metal get sort of heavier, more aggressive and faster, I suppose. So yeah, I think Judas Priest and Motorhead were like two very key bands in the history and the evolution of metal, but don't really belong in any sort of like strict genre. They're like their own things. They are gods. The next biggest thing to talk about here is definitely Nawabum, or the new wave of British heavy metal. But I'm just going to keep it short. So Nawabum was definitely sort of like the next key moment in the evolution of metal, where they sort of like took the aggression and the speed of like punk, I guess, but fused it with you know, just rock and roll, right? You know, very influenced by Judas Priest and Motorhead and lots of sort of earlier pre-metal bands. Definitely characterized by the sort of the twin lead guitars. You know, that's sort of like the main sort of key cliche of Nawabum. And it's around this point that the sort of like the heavy metal front man with like big operatic, powerful vocals and like strong stage presence really sort of like came into its own and was sort of like an important staple in making that like a metal trademark. So obviously the biggest bands that came out of this movement was Iron Maiden. Then we also have Saxon, pretty notable, Diamond Head, Angel Witch, Grim Reaper. But yeah, you get the idea. Those bands are definitely that sum up the Nwabum sound. Here we go. I think that looks pretty good to me. There was also like a little bit of crossover between Nwabum and doom metal, like the early stuff. For example, bands like Witchfinder General and what would be the other one? Pagan Altar, I think, yeah. Well, there was a bit of crossover here between Nwabum, like the Nwabum sound and like the early doom metal sound, where it's all like somewhere in between, where like the music sort of sounds like Nwabum, but it sounds a bit more sort of like underground with more sort of like occulty kind of themes. So yeah, definitely worth making a note of that. All right, then after this, really metal was just sort of like, you know, blown wide open and exploded. And it really, you know, we open a can of worms at this point. So it's kind of hard to really categorize some of the bands that came after. So I'm just gonna have an umbrella term for like classic metal. You know, bands that are obviously not Nwabum, but not like anything that came after, like thrash. Just sort of like accessible, classic, traditional heavy metal. So bands that characterize this sound, I would say would be Dio, Twisted Sister, probably. Maybe like Accept would be another one. UFO, Queensryche, another one that we'll talk about a bit more later. How did you spell that? Oh my god, Queens, something like that, I think. And Merciful Fate is another important band, I think. A lot of people sort of group them into like early black metal, but I think it's worth talking about them more as like a classic metal band. Because they were very influential on many bands that would come later, but they still had that like definitive classic metal sound. All right, then past this point, it really is just like a free-for-all. So we're gonna have to be really mindful of space here. So I think the next one to talk about is probably hair metal, or I guess glam metal, some people will call it, where it's just like a very super commercial style of classic metal. They sort of like kept the tropes with like, you know, the heavy mid-tempo power chord riffing, big guitar solos, harmonized stuff. It's just like, it was mostly aesthetic, you know, it was all about the sort of the pretty boy glamorous image, you know, with like the big hair and the crazy spandex and all that stuff. A lot of crossover with classic metal, but it's definitely like its own thing. It had its own scene. I mean, you'll probably know most of these bands, right? So Motley Crue, Rat, Dokken, Poison, Whitesnake. All of these bands were massively successful around this time and birthed lots of amazing guitar players too, which is worth noting. All right, and then obviously the big one past classic metal would be thrash, I suppose. Heavily influenced by Nwabum with like the sort of like the speed and like the rawness, right? And just sort of like took it to the next level, just like made it heavier, made it faster, more aggressive. Just everything was just sort of like turned up to 11, right? So thrash metal, you know, we all know these bands, obviously. You know, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, can't forget Testament, Exodus, thrash metal. Actually, thinking about it now, I think it makes more sense to link thrash to Nwabum because, like, you know, it's around the similar time that these classic metal stuff was popping off. So I feel like classic metal and like thrash metal were sort of two different branches that came off of Nwabum. So yeah, I think that makes more sense, to be honest. All right, and then there is obviously not just one type of thrash. There's a few notable subgenres. So we have the German stuff, Teutonic. I'm not exactly sure how you say it. I think it's Teutonic thrash, which is basically just like bands that came from Germany that had like a very specific sound. It was definitely heavier than the American stuff. Definitely more evil. And more sort of like leaning towards like what death metal would turn into, I would say. So we got Destruction, Creator, Sodom, Tankard. Yeah, so they would be like the big ones in that style. And then we have crossover thrash, which is sort of like the other side of it, where it's more, I'm not sure, I think it's better like that, which is more sort of influenced by the punk and hardcore side rather than the metal side. So we got DRI, Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, I think they were called. Suicidal Tendencies. Well, modern band, we have Power Trip, definitely a crossover band. Definitely leaning more on the sort of like hardcore side of things. All super good bands, big fan. And then the last one, the best subgenre name of all time, we have pizza thrash. So this is more sort of like a throwback kind of genre, I guess, sort of bands that have that like Municipal Waste kind of aesthetic with like the 80s, 90s, like, you know, Goosebumps looking artwork and stuff, with more sort of like fun, goofy song themes and lyrics. So obviously Municipal Waste. We also got Gamma Bomb, Lich King. We're running out of room, so I'll just do one more. Whoa, Pizza Thrash, there we go. All right, so the next stop on our journey is going to be coming from thrash metal, because like hair metal didn't really go anywhere. Like classic metal, I mean, like sort of went off in a million different directions, right? But sort of nothing like definitive. Whereas thrash metal had a very clear progression to death metal. In my opinion, the first death metal band ever was Death. There's a bit of debate about this. Some people think it was Possessed, but to me they sound just more like a thrash band. Whereas Death really have all the hallmarks of what death metal would turn into. And then that would go into, I guess, sort of traditional early like death metal. So we'll just say traditional death metal. You know, all of the old American household names: Cannibal Corpse, Deicide, Obituary, Morbid Angel. So if you're not really sure what makes death metal, it's like thrash metal, but more, well, even more aggressive, with like sort of low guttural aggressive vocals that sort of sound like a, Cookie Monster crossed with a barking dog, I suppose. Blast beats, which sort of basically just means doing like one-hand rolls on the snare, just like very fast drum stuff, lots of fast double kick. More sort of like dissonant, discordant riffing, lots of tremolo picked sort of one note riffs. So yeah, just like thrash, but a little bit more Satan. Oh boy, when it comes to subgenres of death metal, there are a lot. So I guess one of the earliest you could say is Swedish death metal. Swedish death metal had like its very sort of signature guitar tone, sort of like super distorted, and like I'm not really sure how to describe it, like quite bass heavy, I suppose, like the old HM2 guitar pedal. So bands of this style would be Entombed, I guess the most famous example, Dismember, Grave, and Unleashed. Traditional Swedish death metal, there we go. And then we also have Melodeath, a huge subgenre of death metal. So Melodeath is short for melodic death metal, which is basically just like death metal but more melodic. There you go, more melodic riffs, often using like lots of harmonies and sort of like more well thought out song structures. Sometimes there would even be some clean singing involved, but I think, yeah, generally not. It's more about like the guitar work that makes it more melodic rather than the vocals generally. I guess I'm not sure if it's the pioneering band, but from my understanding, like the Melodeath band is at the gates. And then we also have In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, two of the more like accessible bands in the genre. Like In Flames are huge. Arch Enemy, Children of Bodom, even I guess you could classify here. Amon Amarth, and then on like the different type of melodic death metal that's sort of like not the European style, like the American style, we've got the Black Dahlia Murder, which is worth talking about. So yeah, as you can see, Melodeath is sort of quite diverse in itself, like if you're aware of all these bands have their own sort of very distinct styles within the genre, but you can definitely say that they all fall under the umbrella term of melodic death metal. We also have tech death, which basically just means sort of death metal, but with very, very complicated, like virtuosic guitar parts, bass parts, drum parts, super fast drumming usually, crazy guitar solos, very technical songwriting, song structures, like lots of weird time signatures. Obviously, the big daddy of tech death is Necrophagus. They sort of really popularized that genre, hugely influential. Obscura, Psychroptic, Archspire, a newer band playing this style. And to be honest, you could even argue that like Death were very early progenitor of tech death themselves. Though obviously by today's standard, their music is not really that technical at all in comparison to these bands. A more sort of niche style of this music, I guess we could say, is symphonic death metal. Not many bands playing this sort of style. I guess it's quite kind of hard to fit like orchestration around it because death metal is so dense and like intense, in the arrangement. So it's kind of hard to leave space for some nice, pretty orchestration. But there are some bands who do this very well. I guess Septic Flesh, maybe one of the bigger ones. Flesh God Apocalypse, one of my favourite bands. I love these guys. More sort of like on the neoclassical side. I guess to an extent you could also say Wintersun. I was thinking about sticking them in like mellow death, but they're kind of very different to the rest of the bands in that. I would say this is probably right. Wintersun is definitely, at its heart, an extreme metal band. But they have very, very cool, dense orchestrations, which sort of like put them above Melodeath and more in like the symphonic kind of realm. So, yeah, I would feel happy sticking them there. Right, and then I guess the last notable subgenre of death metal that we want to talk about is pretty influential one, I would say, is brutal death metal. So, I mean, this is pretty obvious. So, death metal, but more brutal, heavier, and faster, but like not in the way that tech death is. Not sort of like, not fast in a technical way, just fast in a really sort of like, more sort of like caveman kind of way. Usually with lower tuned guitars. I guess like the very first brutal death metal band you could say is Suffocation, massively influential band. So like they were along the lines of like traditional death metal, but they definitely had their own thing going on that became very influential on later stuff and more modern stuff that we're going to talk about in a sec. So Suffocation, Nile, Aborted, Dying Fetus as well. Another pretty technical band as well, but definitely fall under the brutal umbrella. Definitely more caveman than bands like Necrophagus and Obscura. So before we carry on down that line, we need to take a sort of like an adjacent detour a second, just move parallel to our current route, and talk about grindcore, because like the genres sort of start to converge at this point, so we need to talk about this really. So grindcore was sort of like a mixture of sort of like underground, like crusty hardcore punk, but with like a more metal sensibility. Just imagine that kind of like crusty hardcore punk stuff, super underground, super like, nasty, anti-establishment, but with more sort of like, heavy metal riffs as opposed to just like, punk power chords and shit. This genre is sort of like, infamous for what we call the micro song, just like very, very sort of short, aggressive, to the point songs, which was of course popularized by Napalm Death, definitely the most famous band in this genre. We also have Rotten Sound, Nasum, Terrorizer. This band, which I probably won't say, I might get demonetized, but so these are probably the most famous examples of grindcore. It's kind of hard to pin where this came from because it's like almost as not metal as it is metal. But I guess the closest thing that we have that it would come from would be death metal, I suppose. All right, and then after a while, I guess like the brutal death metal sound, that came from Suffocation and stuff, and grindcore converged into something else entirely called slam, or slamming death metal. So slam, kind of hard to describe, but it's basically just like really sort of fucking caveman, Neanderthalic death metal with some grindcore influences mixed in. I guess like the biggest, most obvious trademarks would be like that sort of like really high-pitched, ringy, pingy snare. That's sort of like, very indicative of that like slam, grindy kind of sound. There's also like a very particular vocal style that's sort of like mega, mega guttural and like sometimes pitch shifted, I think, where it just sort of sounds basically just like farting in a bathtub at this point. And very, very just sort of like super dumb, like a one finger, highly distorted guitar riffing. Yeah, I don't know why it took me so long to remember the word guitar riffing. So I guess like the key bands in the slam genre, we've got Devourment, Ingested, Peeling Flesh, a newer band, pretty big. Horror, how do you say that? Abominable Putridity, though that is slamming death metal. And there are some other more specific subgenres of like these kind of sounds that there's a lot of overlap all over the place here, but they're worth talking about. We have Death Grind. God, where the hell am I going to put this? Okay, yeah, I'll see that here in the corner. So Death Grind, I suppose, is like brutal death metal, but with more of but also with a grindcore influence, but doesn't sound like slam. It's sort of like an adjacent thing. This is a bit more like on the metal side, whereas like slam is a bit more on like the hardcore side, I suppose. So yeah, just like very, very brutal death metal with grindcore sensibilities, but more on the metal sort of side, right? Popular bands in this genre, probably the biggest one would be Cattle Decapitation. I think this is probably the band to listen to if you're not really sure on like how to characterize this sound, because if you listen to Cattle Decap, it's like, it's sort of death metal, but it has its own sound as well, right? That's, you can hear is very sort of like grindy as well, for lack of a better word. Misery Index, super cool band. And I'm not how sure you say this, Phallic Carnage? I think we're also going to have this as like a parallel thing from these two. Because it definitely is a mix between brutal death metal and grindcore, but in a different way to Slam. Then we also have Gore Grind. Gore Grind is basically it's somewhere between grindcore and Slam, but the themes are just exclusively about like gore, unsurprisingly, like surgery or like you know, murdering, you know, lovely grisly shit like that. The definitive gore grind band, I guess, would be like early Carcass, like the first couple of albums. Other bands, we've got General Surgery and Gutalex. From what my understanding, just sing about poo, which is fucking sick. Like, yeah, there we go. That's my best attempt at trying to sum up the world of death metal. So, we talked about death metal, and now let's talk about the you know, the ugly, more virgin sister of death metal, black metal. So, black metal is a bit of a tricky one to pin down because it comes from a couple of different places. First off, I think it's maybe worth talking about Venom. Even though, you know, Venom were a pretty shit band, to be fair, right? I mean, like, they're funny like a sort of a corny, naff way. But they were very influential on the black metal scene and, like, image, I suppose. And obviously they coined the term black metal, right? You know, off their, was it their first album or second album? I can't remember. One of the first two albums, I think. Definitely an influential band in their own right, worth talking about. And so Venom were basically a Nawabin band, I guess, or just like an offshoot of a Nawabin band. We're going to have to draw a big-ass arrow going all the way around. Early black metal. So yes, very much came from, I guess, you got to say Venom as like a very, very early influence, but the earliest black metal bands, I guess in like the very, very primitive stuff would be like Bathory, Hellhammer, and Celtic Frost, probably the big ones. Yeah, and also from what I understand, a lot of like early black metal was very influenced by like hardcore punk, like GBH, bands like that, I think. So yeah, a lot of, to be honest, like a lot of the black metal, the early black metal sound like came from punk really, like just, maybe even more so than metal. So yeah, obviously it was influenced by, you know, like early metal, like Nawabin, Motorhead, Venom, but yeah, also a lot of punk stuff. So yeah, like early black metal is sort of like its own, like, had its own parallel path to like the rest of this other stuff. All right, then obviously from that came second wave black metal, which is the, you know, the black metal that most people know, right? Burning churches and the Satanism and all that sort of stuff, right? So yeah, you've got bands like, you know, the ones everyone knows, Mayhem, Burzum, Gorgoroth, Dark Throne, is that one word? Yeah. Immortal, Satyricon. So if you're not aware of like, you know, the trademarks of the black metal sound that sort of like was really pretty much sort of solidified in this wave, characterized by very sort of trebly thin, like buzzsaw-like guitars with a tremolo picked riffing, but in a different way to death metal, often using sort of like, yeah, obviously power chords, but also like dyads. It can either be like very abrasive and punky, but also be like beautifully melodic sometimes, black metal, in like the riffing style, which is something I've always loved about the genre. And the vocals are like super like raspy and like all that sort of stuff, right? Kind of like the opposite to death metal. So from what I understand, like the second wave black metal is sort of like a rebuttal against death metal, because for some reason they thought that death metal was like too commercial, so they wanted to make something like, you know, less accessible and more like underground and cult. And like death metal, black metal has shitloads of subgenres, and most of them are actually like quite notable as well. It may be one of like, or maybe even the metal subgenre that has like the most like notable sub-genres, I suppose, right? We've got symphonic black metal, basically just black metal with some sort of like spooky Halloween keyboards, and sometimes sort of like full-blown orchestration, but usually not. The most famous band in this subgenre is Emperor, of course, pretty much pioneered that kind of sound, from what I understand. Because I got Dimmu Borgir, pretty big, Balsagoth, props if you remember those. Super cool, cheesy band. Limbic Art. We also have post-black metal, which is an interesting one. Kind of a large umbrella term for bands that like have have at their core a black metal sound, but sort of also equally implement other genres from like outside of black metal. This is actually a very big genre that's quite vast and spans lots of different styles. But I guess some of the most notable examples would be Arcturus, pretty quirky band, kind of proggy. Ulver, who famously sort of mixed like electronic music and well, all sorts of stuff really, with like a black metal sort of core at their sound. Alcest, who was sort of like post-black metal, like the most traditional sense, where mixing like post-metal, I guess you would say, where it's a bit more sort of like shoegazy and ambient. Amours, which is very sort of like a French arty band, super cool. And Death Heaven, also a bit like Alcest, that they're post-black metal in the more sort of like traditional shoegazy kind of sense. Very cool subgenre there, I like a lot of these bands. A more sort of like niche subgenre of black metal would be folk black metal, I suppose. Kind of notable bands in here like Borknagar, super cool band. Moon Sorrow, more sort of like Viking-y vibes going on. Enslaved, also got that kind of Viking prog thing going on. Windir, early Fintroll. Another one, ambient black metal, which is pretty much what it says on the tin. Black metal that is like, I guess like sort of less heavy and abrasive and more sort of about just making some lovely like soundscapes, I guess you could call it. More about just sort of like immersing yourself in like the atmosphere of the music. One of the most famous ones would be Summoning, that makes songs about like Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings and stuff. Wolves in the Throne Room will come under this umbrella probably. And Drudk, I'm sure how you say that. Also a lot of Burzum stuff, I guess past like the early albums, a lot of that would be classified as ambient black metal, I suppose. Overlaps a bit with like dungeon synth, that kind of thing. All right, and the last one would be DSBM, or Depressive Suicidal Black Metal. Unsurprisingly, it's just black metal, but with themes about offing yourself. Very cheery stuff. Bands in this genre are Shining, which are actually a super cool band. Zasther from America. So like America's version of Burzum, I think. Silencer, Nocturnal Depression. Definitely that one sounds like a DSBM band. There were probably more, but like these are definitely the most notable subgenres of black metal that are actually worth talking about. All right, so that is death metal and black metal done, I think. So there is a bit of crossover between the two as well. Pretty cool genre that I guess we would call blackened death metal. As you can imagine, death metal, or just straight up death metal, but with sort of like a blackened tinge to it, some blackened sensibilities. Often in the riffing style, sometimes in the vocals, or just more like the overall vibe. But yeah, it's like a very cool cross between the two genres. Definitely the most popular being Behemoth. Probably the most famous blackened death metal band, because if you're unsure about this sound, like just go to Behemoth and you'll see. Like they're very much a traditional death metal band at their core, but they have there's a lot of black metal in their riffing, and just in like the overall sort of aesthetic and like vibe of things. We also have Dissection. I think you could probably call them a blackened death metal band. We also have Belphegor, another great example of this. Akakokir, one of my personally favourite bands, amazing band, and Goatwhore. Another sick band. There we go. Blackened death metal. Sick subgenre there. So I guess that would be a cross between, so second wave and probably a traditional death metal, I suppose. All right, so now that's death metal and black metal talked about, I think now would be the time to talk about power metal, which is sort of like another adjacent parallel path to what was happening around this time. I guess the earliest power metal could be described as a cross between like Iron Maiden and like Accept, I suppose. So where the hell are we going to put this? Maybe over here. Power metal. Okay, we're going to have an arrow going from Nawabum, and also from classic metal, I suppose. So I'll just do an arrow out here, and then merge it into this one. Starting to get mighty complicated now. So power metal, like I said, is a progression of like Iron Maiden and Accept, often with very flashy, virtuosic kind of guitar solos, stupidly high vocals, and very sort of like cheesy, fantastical lyrical themes. I guess that would be how you describe traditional power metal. Right, so obviously the biggest sort of early band would be Helloween, the most influential one. Also got Blind Guardian, Gamma Ray, which I think was sort of like an offshoot of Helloween. Stratovarius, Hammerfall, I guess. Yeah, it's bands like this that it would classify as classic power metal, the more sort of like, I call it like denim jacket kind of stuff. There's a couple of offshoots of this sound. We have, I guess you could call it like symphonic / neoclassical, where it's basically just classic power metal, but with the nerdiness and the fantasy amped up, you know, even higher, with more sort of like refined, classical influenced like arrangements, more complicated musicianship, often with like, you know, more complicated symphonic orchestral arrangements. One of my favorite subgenres of just music in general. I guess the big daddies of this genre would be Rhapsody. Then we also have Angra, Camelot, and then more recently Twilight Force, my band. And who else? Oh, Galneus, of course. Oh, and Symphony X, I guess you could lump under this. So like they have elements of prog too. But at their heart, I guess they're a, you know, a symphonic power metal band, really. And then we also have, I guess, like more sort of like modern power metal sound, because it's definitely very different to the classic sound. I'm not really sure if there's a more accurate name, but I just call it modern power metal. It has more of sort of like a Eurovision kind of sound, often more like dancey, like just sort of like almost like 4-chord pop kind of sound. So bands in this style, I guess we could say Ailstorm, Windrose, Powerwolf, Dragon Force, even I suppose. Like earlier Dragon Force is more sort of like, you know, true power metal, but, you know, more modern Dragon Force falls more under this kind of umbrella. Beast in Black, pretty sick band. All right, and that is power metal done. So next up, I think, would be groove metal. This would be the next important one to talk about. Where am I going to put that? Groove metal will stick up here, because groove metal is definitely an offshoot of thrash. More sort of like slowed down mid-tempo thrash metal, right? So just imagine the most sort of like groovy mid-tempo parts of thrash metal songs, give it a little bit more sort of like, make more attitude and machismo and a bit less like, a bit less nerdy, and that's how you would say what you would say groove metal sounds like. So the definitive groove metal band, of course, is Pantera, who really popularized the genre. A lot of people say White Zombie also, pretty instrumental in making this genre big. Lamb of God, super popular band in this genre. Gojira, of course. Machine Head also, I think you could lump into here, because they're not quite thrash metal, but definitely groove. Sepultura, I guess, after the thrash stuff, right? Post-thrash Sepultura. All right, there we go. That is groove metal. So yes, this is definitely an offshoot of thrash. So let's schmack it up there. There is definitely another band we have to mention. Well, I'm going to stick it up here. It's Meshuggah. So Meshuggah is a funny one. Probably up there in like the top 5 most influential metal bands of all time. You know, up there with like, you know, Judas Priest and like Death and stuff. We're going to talk about Meshuggah a bit more later in better detail, but this was an extremely important, influential band in the evolution of metal, and they came from like a few different places, because they were around like way earlier than people think. I think they were around like in the early to mid-90s even, I think. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where they came from, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to keep them as an offshoot of groove metal, because if you trace modern metal back through its sort of like lineage, I guess, so yeah, it sort of roughly takes this route. All right, next up, I think we're going to have to talk about nu metal, I think. So nu metal, one of the most significant and important cultural movements in alternative music, I would say, ever. It's kind of hard to like pinpoint and describe exactly, because it's actually a very broad genre, but it's like I guess a kind of like what we would say like alternative metal that's like not exactly like true metal, but and like metal adjacent, but has enough metal influences to, you know, to include it. I guess like the cliche trademark nu metal sound would be sort of just like basic like caveman groove metal riffs combined with rapping and sort of like hip hop sensibilities, I suppose. So obviously the bands that are most popular in this genre would be Korn, probably like the progenitors of this sound, Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, Mudvayne, Mushroomhead, Cold Chamber. What gets complicated about this genre is that a lot of people will think of, you know, some very other big bands sort of in this style, like System of a Down and Slipknot, for example. It kind of depends whether you want to like think about nu metal as like a sound or just like a cultural movement, right? If a cultural movement, then yeah, I guess you can include like all of these bands, but if we're just talking about sounds, which I think is more like what we're doing, these other bands like Slipknot and Sode, I think fall more into this other genre, which I would call alternative metal. And so this is kind of a place where I stick bands that sort of were around in this sort of new metal time in this movement, but didn't really sort of like fit in with the other bands. They sort of had their own thing going on with like different influences, and oftentimes more metal leaning, whereas like a lot of these other bands weren't so much. They had more sort of outside influences. So obviously, Sode, also Slipknot, which were essentially just like a very accessible death metal band, really, with like some like new metal leanings. Evanescence, a good example here. Also Deftones, they were definitely going here, and probably Disturbed as well. People were on the sort of like butt rocky kind of side, but yeah, they fit. So new metal came from some other places too, like outside of metal, but as far as metal's concerned, it probably just came from groove, so we'll just stick it there. And then I'm just gonna have alternative as an offshoot of new metal, because it's kind of an adjacent thing, but a little different. Right, so next up, I think we're going to go with Gothic. So this is kind of a tricky one. Like, with something like new metal and alternative metal, like Gothic metal is such a big catch-all umbrella phrase that encompasses many different styles of bands that sort of come from all over the place. Bands often defined as Gothic metal would be Typo Negative, which have a very much like a doom and a punk kind of thing going on. Cradle of Filth, which kind of a mixture of like traditional metal and like black metal. But then you also have Moonspell and Lacuna Coil, who again have, you know, their own very different sounds going on that sound, you know, completely different to Typo and Cradle. So it's kind of difficult to pinpoint this as like wholly a genre. So actually, I'm just going to stick some question marks around this one because it's a... So yeah, with these weird sort of broad umbrella genres that don't really come from a specific place, I'm just going to stick them together actually in this own sort of like category. So like, what else can we say? Industrial metal, I guess that's another good example of this. Again, all of the bands that you sort of group into this genre sort of come from varying different places that it's kind of hard to pin down exactly. So you got like Ministry, Fear Factory, Rammstein, Godflesh, Static X, a Young Lad. Yeah, because like all of these bands are like so wildly different. Like Fear Factory, I guess you could just say is like more of a groove metal band. Rammstein is like barely even metal, I suppose. Static X is more sort of like new metal-y or alternative metal, and SYL is like more, I don't know, more like death metal or like, you know, grind influenced, right? It's like all over the place. One more, I think folk metal. This is again a massively broad genre that could just mean like so many different things. So here you have like Tyr, Korpiklani, Fintroll, Eluvieti, Ensiferum, Turisas. You know, some from like death metal, some more like black metal influence, some like more groove. Yeah, I think these three genres are just like way too broad to really sort of pin down. These ones are in their own little thing that just sort of like come from all over the place, where they're sort of like, they're just about specific enough to be able to sort of like have its own thing to group bands together, but they're too broad and have too many different influences to be able to just, you know, be specific about it. Otherwise I'll have to have like so many different, you know, millions of arrows going all over the place and it'll just be illegible. I feel a bit bad making this a genre, and a lot of people don't like it, but it definitely is a thing, whether you like it or not. It's like female fronted, Gothic symphonic. Actually, I'm just going to shorten that to FF. This was definitely a genre and like a movement in itself, right? It was actually huge and very influential. So, you know, this is obviously bands like Nightwish, Epica, William Temptation, Leaves' Eyes. You know, all those sort of bands, right? From that particular time period where there were just like countless bands that were just like copying this sort of style. And this definitely comes from... I guess, yeah, just like an offshoot of Gothic metal, I suppose, right? I guess there's actually, you could even say there's a bit of a symphonic power metal in there too. I'm gonna stick that up there. God, this is looking mental so far, look at that. Oh my God. All right, so where's next? We're actually starting to thin out the list a bit now, getting there. So progressive metal. So progressive metal is essentially, I guess, a cross between power metal and like traditional metal, but with added complexity. Like, just think about like what tech death is to death metal, like progressive metal is to like traditional metal. I suppose it's just sort of like traditional metal blueprint, but made like way more complicated with more sort of virtuoso performances, more complicated arrangements, lots of crazy time signatures, high vocals. Progressive metal. Where are we going to stick that? So where's traditional? Oh, okay, classic metal is here. Okay, yeah, we'll stick it down here. I think that makes sense. Again, this is a little bit of an umbrella term, but more specific than the ones that were up here. Obviously, the progressive metal band is Dream Theater, the one that, you know, everyone just copies. And they're still kings even to this day. Haken, Between the Buried and Me. I'm just going to abbreviate them. Between the Buried and Me, great example. More sort of like crossing prog with metalcore. Opeth, pretty genre blending again, but definitely prog at its core. Mastodon, Leprous. So that should give you a good idea of what, like, you know, the classic progressive metal sound is. Essentially, like, progressive metal comes from Dream Theater, really, and Dream Theater were massively influenced by Queensrÿche. So I think we'll just do it, we'll be very broad and just say it's an offshoot of classic metal. There we go. So from prog metal came more modern prog metal. I was going to have gent as like a separate category, but I think I'm going to lump them in together because it makes sense. They're sort of one of the same. So we're going to say modern prog / gent. So modern prog metal is essentially sort of like where they took like the Dream Theater blueprint, but sort of like mixed it with, you know, more modern, like genty riffing style, right? And if you don't know what I mean by gent, it's a style of metal music characterized by sort of heavy 8 or 9 string guitars that produce a very sort of like dong, 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 genty sort of sound, right? Which was basically pioneered by Meshuggah a long, long time ago. Longer ago than a lot of people remember. Kind of just want to send it through the middle, but I'm going to have to be very careful with bands that fall into this category. Would be, I guess, the big boys would be Periphery, Animals as Leaders, Monuments, Tesseract. So yeah, if you're aware of those bands and you understand what like modern prog / gent means, modern prog was a combination of say Meshuggah and progressive metal here. As an offshoot of gent, very recently we have a subgenre called Thal or Thul. I'm not exactly sure how you meant to say it, but I'm pretty sure. I think it's spelled like that, right? This is a very sort of specific genre, but it's a more sort of like extreme version of gent, I suppose. Pretty much just characterized or invented by, I'm not exactly sure of the details, by the guy from Vildhjarta and Humanity's Last Breath. I think it's the same guy. Another cool band I know do the style is Mirror. Pretty cool stuff. All right, and now we're on to the genty stuff. I think we're going to wrap things up by talking about core, and that will be it, I think, because that's all like the sort of the trad stuff out the way. Metalcore is basically well, in the earliest sense, traditional sense, it's a mix between like hardcore music and metal music. But the sort of metal that it was mixed with kind of varies, but I guess you could just sort of boil it down to groove metal. I suppose you could just sort of characterize early metalcore as groove metal mixed with hardcore, mixed with some other things depending on like which band you're talking about. So yeah, to keep things simple, I think we're just going to have this as an offshoot from groove metal. Metalcore down here. We have bands like Converge, who are Converge and Earth Crisis. I think people believe are like the two sort of best examples of early metalcore. Also Hatebreed. It's a great example of early metalcore, and the Dillinger Escape Plan, who mix sort of like mathy stuff in with this style. And that would be our OG metalcore. And then off of that, of course, we have a few different variations. We have our beloved 2000s metalcore, very influenced by melodic death metal as well, and thrash metal. So you're basically mixing the hardcore elements of you know, metalcore with like the breakdowns and stuff, but with more sort of like traditional metal elements. Lots of guitar solos, great guitar work, great drumming. Usually a mix between sort of harsh vocals and clean vocals. You know, it's sort of like the cliche thing of 2000s metalcore, like the aggressive verse and the clean, epic chorus, which of course characterized by Killswitch Engage. As I Lay Dying, Avenged Sevenfold, Bullet for My Valentine, Trivium, All That Remains. So even though like we characterize this as metalcore, like there was, you know, huge metal influence in here, like less on the hardcore side. We also have to put Melodeath as a influence down here, because basically like the 2000s metalcore style of riffing was like basically just ripped off like at the Gates style. And then we also had, on the other side of the spectrum, we had like what we call, I guess, like MySpace metalcore, which was the other end. Instead of being like more metal leaning, it was more like post-hardcore leaning, like more emo, that side of things, but just with enough metal thrown in for it to sort of just about be metal, right? This is bands like Attack Attack, or like, you know, that sort of crabcore sort of shit. The Devil Wears Prada, Asking Alexandria, I Wrestled a Bear Once. Yeah, you know, like all the sort of typical core kid music. It was basically just like you were in one of these two camps, right? You like the sort of the more metal leaning stuff or the more like post-hardcore leaning stuff. All right, and then you have modern metalcore, I suppose. So we'll stick it down here. So modern metalcore, like where we're at now, it's so different to the OG stuff, or even like the 2000 stuff. It's completely different. So instead of like the more sort of like metal, sort of like traditional metal or Melodeath style riffing, it's more sort of djenty style riffing. Everything's a bit more sort of like slower or like mid-tempo. There's not really much in the way of like fast stuff. A lot more poppy, more sort of like, you know, commercial pop influenced vocals. Very accessible stuff, like so, which is why it's, you know, massively popular now. To be honest, like modern metalcore is like the metal of today, right? And so bands in this style, of course, Bring Me the Horizon, the big boys of this style, like super forward-thinking band, Architects, Spiritbox, I guess Northlane, Ice Nine Kills, Bad Omens. And to be honest, like even with these bands here, like the styles vary quite a lot. Like Bring Me is sort of like, you know, all over the place. Architects is more sort of like butt rock. I guess Bad Omens is like, you know, very accessible, commercial, like barely metalcore, to be honest. Spiritbox, like pretty heavy, but also like super catchy. Ice Nine Kills, maybe a little bit more on the sort of like leaning towards more of the 2000s side, but still very much, you know, unmistakably modern, contemporary. So I guess modern metalcore is sort of like, it's not really directly derivative from OG stuff. It's sort of like a mix of all of them. So it's a mix of some of like the MySpace stuff, it's a mix of some of the 2000s stuff, and it's also a mix of like a gent as well. So three-way action in here. All right, then lastly, our very final genre to put in would be deathcore. So deathcore is super easy to pin down. It's basically just a mix of like, I suppose, brutal death metal with metalcore. The type of metalcore, I guess, depends on which era of deathcore we're talking about. The OG deathcore would be like the 2000s stuff. So 2000s deathcore, whereas, you know, very sort of like primitive. I guess it was sort of like, it came from like the MySpace metalcore scene really, more so than like the, you know, this 2000 stuff. Because like a lot of the guys who played 2000s deathcore like looked like, you know, like they were in like Attack Attack or something, or Asking Alexandria, with all like, you know, the tight jeans and like the funny emo hair. The biggest bands of this time, I guess, were Suicide Silence, Thy Art Is Murder, Whitechapel, Job for a Cowboy, they were pretty sick, and All Shall Perish. It's going to be coming off of MySpace metalcore rather than the other one. And then we're going to mix in some brutal death metal. So yeah, let's say a mix of like MySpace metalcore and brutal death metal. And then the more modern deathcore that comes off that, we move past the MySpace aesthetic, thank God. Well, the genre definitely became a lot more serious and less sort of like a campy, which it definitely was back in these days. Modern deathcore has become like an arms race just to see who create the most like ridiculous, crazy breakdowns and stuff, which was definitely instigated by Lorna Shore, probably the biggest band of this style. Also Slaughter to Prevail, very big band. They also have like a bit of a new metal influence too. Shadow of Intent, a little bit symphonic, which is kind of cool, like to see that. Mental Cruelty, also kind of on the symphonic side. Brand of Sacrifice, more straight up, which is just a direct descendant of here. There we go. And there we have it, guys. Mapped out the entire history and evolution of metal done in one big old roadmap family tree kind of thing. It definitely took a lot longer than expected and was more hard work than I thought trying to think all this stuff through. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did I do? Do you agree with how I've mapped everything out? What would you change? I think I'll upload this as well, just so you can, you know, have a look at it yourself and browse it and maybe do your own. That would be sick. If you do your own, just let me know, like send me a message on Instagram or Discord or something. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you later. Goodbye.